Good evening. It's Friday, May 14th, and I'm Virginia Amos, and we are at the end of week one of our one-on-one interviews with all of the city council candidates who are running in the June primary. The Zebra newspaper and ZTV do not endorse any candidate, but we are offering this as a public service to our viewers. We go for about 30 minutes. We are asking the same set of questions to each candidate, and if time allows, at the end, we will take questions from the viewer feed. If by any chance time does not allow or we do not get to all of the questions, our guest can go back and answer those at a later date. So let's get started. Our guest tonight is Alyia Gaskins. Welcome, Aaliyah.
Thank you.
And in full transparency, I will tell you that Aaliyah and I served together on the board of Agenda Alexandria, but we've never met. We've done a lot of Zoom calls together, but we've never actually met. And my phone is going off. So if you will give us 2 seconds, we are going to fix that, and I apologize.
That's funny. Well, I will just say it is good to be with you in person, and especially on your birthday. I feel honored that I get to meet you.
Yes, it is my birthday, folks. Yes. It's just the way the world works out. Mm-hmm. And it's also, I will tell you, it's my husband's birthday, so it's been kind of a double celebration, and we've had a great time. And I'm actually kind of ready for it to, to slow down a little bit. So, let's get started. I'm going to ask you a few just icebreakers.
Okay,
that
sounds good.
Makes it fun for me and makes it fun for the audience. So, how long have you lived in Alexandria?
So, I have been here almost 6 years, so about 5 years and some change.
Okay, and what part of Alexandria do you live in?
I live in the West End, specifically Cameron Station.
Okay. We actually have a lot of West End candidates this year.
We do.
Yeah.
And it's exciting.
It is exciting.
And important. I think as a West End resident, we are, we often feel like sometimes our voices haven't been heard. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be great to get some new West End representation.
Good. Okay. What 3 words best describe you?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say I'm an optimist. So I'm definitely the friend you call when your world is falling apart and you need somebody to tell you it's going to be okay and we're going to get through this. I would say I'm also a doer. I'm the type of person who if something needs to be done, I'm going to get it done.
Okay.
Or I'm going to find somebody who will. And then I would say I'm a mom.
Yes, you are.
You and I were talking earlier about Zeke running up and down the stairs and, all of the different things that are happening now that he's turned 1. And I just feel that that's a huge part of my identity right now and the way that I think and approach things. So
I would absolutely. So what is something that most people don't know about you or they'd be surprised to know about you?
Another good question. I guess people would be surprised to know that in high school, I was actually the varsity lacrosse goalie. And then I played club lacrosse in college. And I think that's surprising because most people don't think I'm that athletic. When you think about athletics in my family, you think my husband, not me.
Okay. So. All right. Well, I like that. And finally, what is your guilty food pleasure?
Oh, man. So I love going to Sweet Frog. And specifically getting their chocolate frozen yogurt with chocolate chips, brownies, chocolate flakes, Reese's peanut butter cups, Reese's Pieces, hot fudge, and like a splash of chocolate syrup. So it's a deep guilty pleasure. It's pretty much everything chocolate that they have goes in that little cup.
That is a sugar high.
It is. And I always tell myself I don't need it, but it's, it doesn't happen very often.
You have to do it. You just have to do it. So you have a busy life. You work full time.
Yes.
You have a child. You have a husband. So was there one dominant issue or situation or even a series of issues that compelled you to throw your hat in the ring? And first, let me thank you for being a candidate. It is sometimes a thankless endeavor. It's time consuming. and you get yelled at.
Yes, you do. It's part of the job, and you can't shy away from that piece of it as well. So I guess what I would say is there were a series of issues. The first would be COVID-19. The reality is most people had no idea what public health is, what they do, and they probably still wouldn't if it wasn't for Dr. Fauci being on their television screen so often. But for me, as somebody who has their master's in public health and has spent the past decade working with communities to take action to become healthier, I understand that our health is a function of the conditions where we live, where we work, where we play, basically anything we do. And so as I watched our city navigate this pandemic, I started thinking about we need somebody who brings a perspective, who understands that health is going to be a function not just of a pandemic, but it's going to be impacted by the decisions we make around housing, the decisions we make around, our small businesses. And so how do we plan and design in a way that really centers health and well-being? So I'm running to really bring that perspective that I think is needed and missing. And then the other, I would say, kind of it goes back to the biggest change in my life and becoming a mom and really looking at our city and trying to find childcare. I remember going to a number of different centers, and my husband and I, we both have good paying jobs. I also have my consulting business in addition to my my full-time job. Yet we were looking at daycares, asking ourselves, how are we going to make this work? In some places, it's the cost of an additional mortgage. Many places had a waiting list. The one in my neighborhood has a waiting list of 18 months. My maternity leave is 4 months. So I don't know how that measures out. And so for me, that also just played on my heart. No parent should be making decisions around what's the cheapest for my child or what's just available, but instead, what's the highest quality and what's that opportunity? And I think if I'm struggling, I only can think about, our low income communities. I think women like my mom who are working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. So how do we make sure that those opportunities are available to more people?
Okay. It's interesting that you mention public health, and I had not thought about it quite like that. But it's also, I think, how we're rethinking infrastructure. And it's not just bridges and roads, but it is. I mean, childcare is infrastructure. If you don't have it, you can't go to work. And if you don't have, I have always felt like preventative medicine is what keeps people healthy.
Exactly.
It's not what happens later.
Yes. And I think too often, as a country, we're trained to think of health as what happens in the hospital.
Yeah.
But it's all of those things that we can prevent outside of the emergency room. So if we're thinking about housing, what kind of quality housing do you live in? Are you dealing with mold? Are you dealing with rodents? Are you dealing with overcrowding? That affects not only your physical health, whether or not you have asthma or other respiratory conditions, but also your mental health.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about, open space and nature in our community, how does that affect your mental health or your ability to build connections and engage with your neighbors? And so it really is, almost all of the decisions we make, how does it impact our physical, mental, and social well-being, as well as our economic health as a city? And I think it's important for us to be thinking about that, not just when it's on the front of everyone's mind,
Right.
but we have a lot of big issues facing us, and I think that has to be front and center.
Yeah. And looking at it holistically.
Yes.
So I think this question is really, I think there's really only one answer to it. And from what I've seen, everybody has kind of agreed with that. But the money that the city of Alexandria is getting through the American Rescue Plan that was announced in March, a large portion of that can be devoted to water, to sewer, and to broadband. And so the question is, are you in favor of devoting a large chunk of that to some of the capital improvement projects, particularly talk about stormwater? That is a mental health issue. Someone brought it up the other night, which I had never thought of it that way, but I can so understand that. You don't want to spend your whole life worrying about whether it's going to rain. So Yes, you're nodding.
Yes,
so
no, I am in absolute favor of that for, a couple of reasons. One, as we've already touched on, the health impacts of the anxiety and the fear that our residents face every time they know it's going to rain. I think, two, the other reason is because it's also a safety issue. There are some folks who I went on a walk with them in their neighborhood, and they talked about how when it rains, they're out there sometimes at night using their foot to feel around, to clear out the drains. That's not safe.
No.
And for them to be out there, and they talked about how cars are sometimes still coming down the street and the water's pushing on them, or if it's late at night, they might, there's a risk of them getting hit by a car. I think it's also an equity issue. There's another family I talked to, and they're older seniors in our community, have lived in their home in Delray for almost 40 years. And for them, they said, you know what, Aaliyah, we don't have the money to just always do the repairs.
Yeah.
And so we've been doing it ourselves. And all I could think about was, again, it's not safe for them to do it themselves, but what if they don't fully get all the water out? And now, the ripple effects that come from that. And then I also think, too, there's the economic implications. I think maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago, Moody's, which is one of our big credit rating agencies, they said, we're going to start, taking into account climate preparedness. And one of the things that impacts whether or not you're prepared is your infrastructure. And can you handle a climate-related disaster? Can you handle these big storms? And we can barely handle, what's not even considered a big storm. And so for all of those reasons, I absolutely am in favor of that. I recognize that there are constraints on when the money needs to be spent. And so I think we have an opportunity to use it for, studies or design work so that we are able to lay the groundwork to do these big projects. And there's nothing that should get in our way for that.
In addition to that, in addition to the questions I have, you talked about walking, and I know that everybody's knocking on doors and you're trying to meet as many people as you can. What are you hearing as the big issues?
Yeah, there's a lot. So I will say density comes up a lot, and a concern about how we grow. I would say another issue that has come up a lot recently are from families who are worried about the real threat of eviction and how they have been hanging on by a lifeline because of the federal moratorium that we have, but recognizing that that's coming up soon and they're not sure what their resources are going to look like or where they can turn to for help. I am hearing more and more around childcare and just overall the conversation around child success in our community. What does that look like, from the buildings where our children learn to the spaces that they have access to? And then also I reached out to a lot of our faith leaders. Just because, my faith is really important to me. And I know growing up that it was often the church where people turn to tell, what they're facing the most and the hardest things are hitting. And there are a lot of families that are struggling with hunger and food insecurity and concerned about where their next meal will come from. So I would say those are, in addition to the usual issues that I think most people know, I think those are the ones that don't get elevated as much, but are critical and point to some of the pain that our residents are facing.
And my husband delivers for the food bank
Okay.
at least once a week, and so I know that it's there and it's all over the city. It's not just in certain areas.
Yes, especially when we think about our seniors, and who are on fixed incomes, and things have gotten even tighter. And they're in many different areas across our community. I think we have great programs like Meals on Wheels, but there are also other needs that they're facing.
Yeah, the people that are falling between the cracks.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have to talk about Seminary Road.
Yes.
And it may or may not affect you specifically in the West End. I happen not to travel that way too often, so I know that it's not been front and center for me, but I know for a lot of other people it is. And so it kind of comes down to, would you be in favor of reversing it completely? Would you leave it as it is? Or would you want to work to perhaps make modifications?
No, I think the question of what we do with Seminary Road is important. Whether or not it's an issue that is an issue to you and I feel from so many of our neighbors, it's something that they're dealing with and are very concerned about. And so I guess given that, what I would say is I think any decision we make about the future of Seminary Road, we have to take into account that frustration. We also have to take into account, the current context, and we have to take into account the future. So what's going to happen as we plan and think about the redevelopment of the Inova site? What'll be the demands on that road? Yeah. I think we also have to think about, what is a successful road? Like, what does that need to look like? I hear people complaining about traffic, and just going back isn't going to alleviate all our traffic issues. Just going back, we've had some great safety improvements from the crosswalks to the sidewalks, and so we lose that just going back. So I think, I'm open to having the conversation, but the conversation needs to take into account how do we best serve all of our users, and what does that look like to meet the demands for this road. I think it also has to take into account the cost. I've heard different estimates, but the one that I most recently heard was when it was at the Alexandria Democratic Committee debate, and they had the number of 700,000.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
And if we, if I'm fortunate to take office in January, we're still going to be dealing with some of the issues that I just talked about, from hunger to our businesses who need rental relief. And so I think we have to have a real conversation about, if we have an extra $700,000, how do we use that?
How do we best use it? Yeah.
So.
You mentioned the Inova complex, and I know that this is a tremendous possibility for the West End and for Landmark, which has been just kind of churning for years and years now. Does that look solid to you?
Say more what you mean by solid. Do you mean like...
Well, maybe as solid as it can be at this point.
So I will say, when it comes to Landmark, you can imagine my neighbors. Most are really excited. Yes. I think some of them, 20 years ago when they moved into Cameron Station, it was just a little flicker in their eyes, and they've been waiting for it to happen. And I think that it is more solid than maybe it's ever been before, and that we have an opportunity that has a real potential to come to fruition. We're seeing plans, we're seeing movement, we're seeing all of these, conversations that make it feel like it's coming. I think what's going to be critical for the next council is we have all of these visions for what the community wants to see there. I know my neighbors, and myself included, we want to see a walkable area. We want to see retail. We want to see open space. And so I think it's not just, is it solid that something's coming, but is that something what we as a community want to see? And how do we stay in conversation with our developers, with Inova, with the community to make that a reality? So,
And having, I live here in Delray, and having kind of been through the whole Potomac Yard and the continuing development, it's tough. It's tough to make those things, to get everybody heard and satisfied. Yeah. We may come back to that, because you mentioned something about green space and public health. One of the first Saturdays, or one of the first days. Gosh, I don't know. The past 2 years feels like it's, just one big continuum. But it was one of the first days where people really felt it was okay to get out. And you took your life in your hands getting on the bike path. I mean, it was...
Oh, yeah. It sounds like you're talking about the trail.
People were desperate, just desperate to have green space. And it just really, I appreciated green space anyway, but it just said to me, we got to watch out for this.
Yes. I think we have to make sure that preserving our green spaces is a top priority for a number of reasons. Because of what you just described, it's a part of how we experience the city, and it's critical for our health and well-being. But also, when you think about parks and green space, it's also where you're out making connections with your neighbors. And I think part of us growing as a city is also growing in relationship with one another. And you do that, whether you're bumping into somebody at the park on a trail, or you're out there in an outdoor concert, or you're at the farmer's market. And so that's important. It's also important for our climate health. And when we think too, as we talked earlier about flooding, making sure that we are not just continuing to create more impermeable spaces. So there's a lot of multiple benefits, and I think that's part of the holistic perspective that I want to bring, that things are not just a priority, but here's the reasons why they're a priority. And here's how we start to think about that, so that as we do development, there's always going to be trade-offs. There's always going to be more things we want. There's always going to be somebody looking for something, but what are those things that we need to see and keep at the forefront of any conversation, so that when we're talking to developers, we're clear about the community benefits we want to see and that we demand.
Yeah. So another kind of overarching hot button, if you will, is around co-location housing. How do you understand it? What do you see in the future?
Yeah. So I think when I hear this topic, I think it's important that we're always talking about the same thing, because co-location in it of itself and co-location of housing, we have good examples of that, like the fire station at Potomac Yard. Co-location is really just putting two uses together. And I think in a city where we're not going to get more land, where we have limited opportunities, we have to be thinking about what's the highest and best use of that land. I think when I'm in conversations with people and it becomes a hot button issue, it's around co-location of housing, any type of housing on our schools.
On schools.
And for me, I've been thinking a lot about this and thinking about it in terms of, I'm excited to one day send my son to ACPS. I also know that ACPS is dealing with a lot of capacity issues and overcrowding, and that we just don't have enough educational spaces. And so for me, it's not that there aren't good examples of, housing on schools. It's not that there aren't examples of housing in communities. But for me, I want to see any opportunity we have with school land, how do we maximize that for educational spaces? Okay. Yeah, and for me, I also think, are we thinking about the schools of the future? So if it's not just, classroom spaces, but what about spaces for performing arts? What about spaces for, like maker spaces, where we have buildings where kids can go and tinker and learn all these cool skills? Or could there be like satellite campuses for, where we partner with the unions and trades and more career and technical opportunities? So I think using our land that imagines the ways in which kids can be exposed to the skills and more opportunities to graduate career ready and college ready is what I'd want to see.
That makes great sense. The Alexandria doesn't have a ward system, so you are representing the entire city, which certainly has its challenges, because we have some very different parts of the city. How do you see yourself and your role on council, and how do you anticipate hearing the most voices?
Yeah. So I will say I've been thinking of my role in two ways. My role, first and foremost, and the role that I would expect from any council member, is we have to be out in community. We have to be out listening and to our neighbors and hearing their concerns, hearing the challenges they face, hearing the barriers that they're coming up against, but also hearing their hopes and aspirations and what they want to see as the vision for the city. I think second, my role is, it's not just hearing that, but my role is to then set the expectation and the agenda for how our city responds and delivers. That might be in policies, that might be in the services we provide, but everything should be in service of that, and really grounded in what are our residents lifting up as their needs. I think in terms of how I go about listening, part of the reason why I'm running is because I feel like often the voices who are most impacted by the challenges in our city, they're not at the table. And not just at the table to be like, okay, we're just sitting here and we're all a part of it, but actually shaping that decision and having agency and power over what happens next. And so I've been trying to lead a campaign that puts me in conversation with the people who I feel are not being heard. So I'll give you an example of how I'm doing it and how I will continue to do it. But, a few weeks ago, I actually went and I sat at the bus stops at Southern Towers. And I brought a friend of mine who speaks Amharic, and I was there with my literature, but I was also just, I want to know. If you have 2 minutes to talk to me while you're waiting for the bus, how's your day? What's going on? What are the things that would make things easier? Today, there was a business owner that I had reached out to, and she runs a salon, and she said, I only have 15 minutes in between clients, and I don't even know if I can talk to you then. I put on my mask, and I sat there, and I watched this lady get her hair done, but I learned about her business in a way that I never knew before. As she talked about in her salon, people, it's not like a formal paycheck program, but your station is based on the number of clients you're bringing in.
Yeah.
And then that, in fact, impacts her income because now she's dependent on that. And so I'm trying to get out there, but I'm also recognizing I can't do this by myself. As much as I'll be in community, I have to be the one working with our city staff to say, okay, here are places you got to go. Here are other voices we got to get. Here's the, the expectation we have around what robust community engagement looks like. Here, the different opportunities we have from online to in person. What are the ways in which we're going to construct an engagement plan that gets as many voices as possible? What are the metrics we're going to use to hold ourselves accountable, not just to how many people show up, but to those stories and those outcomes? So that's really important to me.
Okay, that is important. How many total members on City Council?
6.
6. Okay, all right. So there were 3 openings this year, which was pretty unusual, as I understand it. Okay, so be interesting. Be interesting to see how maybe we'll have a West End coalition. Who knows?
We'll see, maybe. The West End Rising, I think, is a phrase I had heard.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so Eli, David, do we have any questions for Aaliyah? Because I could just kind of keep talking the whole time. Okay, all right, so we're good. So, tell me how public health operates. This is my ignorance, I admit it. Is there a public health department in this? I'm sure there is in the city of Alexandria.
So we have a local health department.
Okay.
And the health department fills many of those public health roles.
Okay.
So from assessing the public's, health to supporting programs around, prevention and wellness to helping create our community health improvement plan, which really sets out the goals for based on the health needs in our community. What are the different policies and opportunities that we have to respond to that? And then also playing the critical lifeline throughout this pandemic of fielding calls, making sure that people have timely and relevant communications, making sure that people are signed up to get the vaccination. So they play many, many different roles.
Well, I know there were people who complained, but I was hugely impressed with the efficiency of being able to sign up online, getting the appointment, going up to T.C. Williams, just being shepherded along, sitting down at a table. I never even knew I got the shot. And, then coming home. I mean, it was seamless. And I complimented one of the women on, how well, and she said, we prepare for this all the time.
No, I'm glad you complimented them because I think that's another thankless job as well. Yeah. And I think for me, so in the early part of the pandemic, I would say that there are folks who had your experience and then there were folks, you always hear from those who complain. But maybe it's the optimist in me, but what I always thought about was if we have bright spots of where it's working, then let's spend time and let's dissect that. Let's figure out then what was it about that experience that we want to make sure we sustain and improve, and what are the things about your negative experience that didn't work. And why was that? And I think as a city, our health department was swamped. So maybe they don't have the time and capacity to do that. Yeah. But that's where we build partnerships. That's where we support one another to then help them figure out so that we can always provide that highest level of service. And now I think the things they're doing around coming into community, I heard, we're going to be activating our mobile ban. We've got all of these different pop-up sites. Those are things that, might need to be sustained, not just from a vaccination perspective, but, maybe they're mental health pop-ups or they're ways that you can come learn about other preventative services.
Well, when the pandemic first started, a year and a half, I started doing, because I'm at home, I'm a realtor, nothing was happening for a short time period. And so I started doing these podcasts basically with business owners saying, how are you doing? And as one business owner said to me, she said, they don't teach you this in culinary school. There is no what to do in a pandemic in culinary school. Yep. And I would imagine that it's the same thing. I talked to Mike Brown, the chief of police. He said, they don't teach you this at the academy. How do you do this? But I think what a great learning experience to really take from this past year and a half, what worked, what didn't, and really build on that, which is, I think, what you're saying, that we have a great opportunity here.
I think what this pandemic has shown us is many things that we thought were impossible are possible.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to leverage that to create a more inclusive Alexandria. And I'll even from, engagement. I remember sitting on the Transportation Commission, and when I first got appointed, I was working at the National League of Cities, and I had to travel to all of these cities all across the country. And there would be times when I'd say, I really want to make this meeting, but I'm stuck in an airport. Can I call in? Or can you Skype me in? Anything. No, and that wasn't allowed. And now we're able to show, that you're able to have, video meetings. You're able to get engagement in different ways. And I think we can learn from that. We can improve on that. But this is our opportunity for some of those things to stay moving forward.
Sounds terrific. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. I could keep going because I love talking to Aaliyah. And like I said, we've known each other through Zoom calls, but this is the first time face to face, and it always makes such a difference. So thank you all so much for being with us. We have Canik Aguirre coming on Zoom at about 8:40. So stay tuned for that. And then we're going to take a break over the weekend because I need it.
Because you're going to celebrate your birthday.
Because I'm going to celebrate my birthday all weekend. And then on Monday night at 8 o'clock, I will be talking to Marone Teklu. I can't read my writing. And then at 8:30, Mark Schiffer. So please stay with us. These are great learning sessions, and you can view them anytime. Thanks to our producer, David McClure, our intern, Eli Wilcox, and as always, to Mary Wadlin, the publisher of the Zebra Press, who makes this all possible. So good night, everybody. Have a great weekend. Good night, Aaliyah.